Sports Talk Chicago. Here with Jon Zaghloul, and we are back and ready for today's special guest. He's the Cubs insider at NBC Sports Chicago, and he's covered the team for 15 plus years. Please welcome Gordon Wittenmyer to the program. Gordon, it's great to have you on. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
So, Gordon, what's your evaluation of this past Cubs season?
Well, it's somewhere between trash bin and dumpster. How about that?
Well, were you expecting that sort of collapse for them?
I wasn't expecting a collapse. If anything, I was kind of surprised that they put themselves in position to basically, they were tied for first place on June 24th. And they went into the season having gutted their starting rotation by trading their best pitcher, the Cy Young runner-up, Yu Darvish, and really didn't do much to replace him except with just these incremental guys that high upside but risk as well. And they didn't get much out of their rotation, even all the way through that start that had them in first place. So that was the big surprise. I didn't expect 11 and 12 game losing streaks after that, however. So maybe the 12 gamer, because that came after trading away all their good players. It was they doomed their season from the start. And despite the players and the field staff's best efforts, it came to fruition, despite that good start.
How tough was it to cover essentially two different teams? You're covering a division leader at one moment, then you're covering a bottom feeder the next.
Yeah, it was different. I've never seen anything like that as long as I've covered baseball, and I've covered baseball for 25 years, 4 different teams. I didn't see as much as I didn't see the great start coming, I also didn't see the full sell-off coming. I figured they'd be a little more targeted and try to keep one or two of the guys to build around going forward so that it wasn't going to be a complete roster rebuild, for whatever their next core looks like. But and mostly because they're a top 3 or 4 revenue team, and those types of teams don't do that. And so when they did, it had a massive deflating impact on that clubhouse and the ball club, in addition to what it did to the talent on the roster. And it was absolutely 2 different teams. Post trade deadline, it was one of the worst teams. You could make the case, you could put it up there with the 3 or 4 of the worst teams in Cubs history, which is really saying something. So that's how sort of whiplashing it was.
Was that the worst Cubs team you've covered, that second half team?
That second half team, and it is. And I covered a 100-loss team in 2012, the first 100-loss Cubs team since the 60s. And this was worse than that team. They had a few players on that team, a few players they could have built around. I think 2012. I think Rizzo finished that season with the club, so they had a little bit of talent by the end of that season. But that team post deadline was worse than that 2012 team.
Gordon Wittenmyer here on Sports Talk Chicago. Gordon, was that the right move by Cubs management to essentially sell everybody and look towards the future?
Well, I've shifted into a role since I left the Sun-Times as more of a columnist with NBC Sports Chicago, and so I've been able to express my opinions a little more, and I'm on the record saying no. No, I think from an ownership standpoint, the way this club has been run almost from the start, despite the championship, which was one assembling a team despite limited resources at the time. If you have time, I can go into all that. But Theo Epstein and Jed Hoyer and that group kind of worked around a tough situation with ownership back then to construct that team that actually won. But the cost cutting during the pandemic, the way they've accrued debt, which is a great business move when debt is cheap and you're expanding your footprint and your organization, but that is on one hand crushing when something like a pandemic comes along and cash is king. They got so skittish with finances, and they're already kind of a skittish ownership group with finances, given that it's dad's money that bought the team. And so this isn't even really, well, we can go down all that road another time, but they got more skittish than most teams over finances during the pandemic. And they wound up the amount of layoffs in the front office of not only scouts and analytics people and baseball operations people making normal salaries, but also just media relations people and administrative people making normal salaries, so that they didn't take as big a hit as billionaires when it came to this. I thought, especially compared to some other teams, I thought that was kind of ugly business. And then we come out the other side of that, and they slash payroll. The non-tender Kyle Schwarber over what would have been an $8 million salary, roughly 8 or 9. They get rid of Yu Darvish. This was a team that won, such as it was in a shortened year, a division championship and made the playoffs, was on a run of 6 consecutive winning seasons, 5 of them in the playoffs. And you gut the team for financial reasons because you're not willing to weather the storm as one of the richest ownership groups in the game, with one of the highest franchise values and one of the year-over-year revenue streams of anybody in the game. You're not willing to take the short-term hit yourself. So you stick it on the fans, you stick it on the front office. And the result was what we saw. It's not pretty. And now they look like they're in a rebuild again, all going back to the way the owners run that team.
Why'd they prioritize building out Wrigley, Bill, instead of prioritizing product on the field? That's what I don't get.
Yes, you do. You know exactly why. It's maximizing profits. It's building the franchise value long-term, profitability long-term. Look, they won a championship in 2016 sooner after Theo and those guys came in than many people expected. What was the first thing they do? I mean, even before they won in 2015, when they finished last in 2014, but they had young players coming that you could identify, they raised ticket prices on spec going into 2015, and they skyrocketed all their prices. I mean, I'm talking merch and everything. I sold everything that wasn't nailed down coming off of that championship, and winning that championship, that rightfully so, a historic, emotional championship that meant so much to a city and a fan base. It was like this green light to just try to print as much money as you could and expand your footprint, expand your profitability. They were already massively profitable. And in doing so, they had some issues on the roster where they had some bad contracts. They weren't developing pitching. Pitching cost way too much. The hitting core started getting more expensive in arbitration years. So they were hitting that luxury tax threshold a lot. So there were some issues with front office decisions that led to them being in a tough place financially. But ownership also didn't help that process. But more to the point, when they got sort of to these last couple of years, then we saw them take advantage of all this. Let me back up a minute. Let me just back up a minute, because you were asking me about all that debt. When they bought the franchise in 2008, 2009, they did it after the economy had tanked. And they did a very complicated, debt-heavy deal to do it. It left them as one of the one of the highest levels of debt in the game. They were actually, by definition of the rules, in violation of baseball's debt rules. Whenever the C-League passed, so be it. So for years, for the first few years of that process, they had banking restrictions that kept them from spending as much on players as they ordinarily would have or could have. We didn't hear that as a public narrative. I had a lot of sourcing on that. I wrote a lot about it. Patrick Mooney with Comcast Sports at the time, and he's now with The Athletic, wrote about it at the time. I think we were the only ones in the market writing about it, but they eventually admitted that this was the case. It was a structure that over 10 years was going to naturally resolve itself, and it would be out from under it, with the opportunity to make more revenues, which they did, and the opportunity to restructure, which I think they did, to alleviate it along the way. Point is this: they won the championship, and when they did, that sort of put them on the other side. That put them at the light at the end of the tunnel stage. And so when they got out from under that, that's when you started seeing all these capital investments in the property around the ballpark and the building the new office tower over there, and growing the product. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. If you own a business and you have the ability to do that, do it. But it was, from an ownership standpoint, that became a priority. Cool. They had the right people in the front office to make baseball as much of a priority as they could. We can get in the weeds on whether they were given enough resources to the front office at the time. But then when push came to shove, we saw how they respond. And that's where the pandemic realities came in. That's where now they're up to their eyeballs in debt through this Hickory Capital LLC thing or whatever it is, where they buy up all the land. Debt management became an issue during the pandemic. And they're trying to recoup that. They're trying to recoup their losses on the backs of the fans. I call it a GoFundMe fan base is the way they're treating it.
Let me ask you this, though. Did you see covering the team sort of a downfall? Did you see the team at least regressing? Is there any justification regarding skill on the field as to why there should be a rebuild or a bit of a retool?
Well, are you talking about going into 2021?
Correct. And then going into next year, too.
Yeah, well, you had the core was short term, regardless, right? And the pitching was drying up, and they had some promising arms in the system, unproven. They were going to give a shot. Adbert Alzolay, had Justin Steele coming, and we saw glimpses of life in him this year. A lot of uneven performances, which comes with young pitchers. Saw Keegan Thompson make his debut. You got Braylon Marquez coming, who missed yet another season in 2021 because of some injury setbacks, but he's got a huge arm if he can stay healthy and could. Okay, so you had this stuff coming, but it wasn't there yet. And so there was probably going to be a transition regardless. And it was about how you were going to go about shortening that, making it more sort of tolerable to the fans. Part of that would have been to identify maybe a couple of those core guys that you try to keep and quit acting like you're the Kansas City Royals when you're doing it. I'll give you an example, right? So they come in with a low ball offer in spring training on Anthony Rizzo. Now, I call it low ball. And if he goes he's in the free agent market now, he may not get close to what that offer was. 4.70, I want to say, 4.70, 5.70. Anyway, so he may not get close to that. But for what it was at the time and what he meant to this franchise, it was an insulting offer. It represented a pay cut, for one thing. And that's, so from a starting point of that, it's a little bit of a backhand to the face of the guy. And look, he took a low deal the first time around. He totally outperformed that deal. Good on the club, and good on him. He signed it because he wanted security. So he doesn't have a right to expect Goldschmidt money, 5 and 130, even though that's probably the closest comp, but maybe something in between 5 and 70 and 5 and 130, right? I think 5 and 100 or 4 and 80 with a vesting option or a mutual option would have been probably overpaying him for his free agent value, but certainly not breaking you and maintaining a fan favorite. And here's the other way I look at this. They got him for 7 years, $41 million. It turned into, I think, 9 and 70 something. He outperformed that entire contract. So let's say it's 9 and 70. I think that's right. So if you add 4 and 80, that's 13 at 150. So if you look at that over the course of a career for a guy that you want to represent your franchise, who's done it, who's won a championship for you, who you call part of your team culture, you could easily look at it that way. And it's still an underpay. And $20 million a year isn't, I mean, in today's baseball dollars, that's not this scary figure that some people want to make it, and it's not going to break your payroll.
Do you think we see a Rizzo or Bryant reunion? I know they're both in free agency. We've seen some rumors. Can you confirm any of that?
No. Well, for one thing, Kris Bryant was never coming back almost from the day he was drafted, and certainly from the day they manipulated his service time. He was never coming back. So there's that. So you can just consider that ship long sailed. Rizzo and Baez, I believe, would be open to returning, with the caveat that would have to mean that the door is slammed shut on Baez with the Mets, because he'd love to stay there with Francisco Lindor. The thing is, I don't think the Cubs want to go down that road again. People in the organization have called it kind of ripping the Band-Aid off. I mean, they took a lot of heat when they jettisoned everybody, and I don't think they want to go down that road again. I don't think they want the reminders of it. If either one of those guys come back, it's going to be coming back on team-friendly deals, like more team-friendly deals than were offered them in terms of extensions. So it could be a 1-year deal for Rizzo type thing, or a 2-year 18, 2-year 20. What I'm saying is, I'm just throwing out numbers. I'm just saying, if his market falls to something like that, they could be in play as a comfort zone for him, and it works for them. And maybe if Baez's market falls, something similar. I don't think they're going to go, if Baez has a market of even a couple of teams bidding for him, I don't think they're going to get into a bidding war. And right now they have no intent of doing that. It would take those guys falling to them and basically coming to them with their hat in their hand. And I don't think that would be a good situation at all. If that is the scenario that plays out and they actually do it, I think it's a mistake.
Why do you say that?
It's hard to go home again anyway. Just ask Jake Arrieta. And to do it on humbling terms, and for a team that honestly probably isn't ready to win, certainly not in a big way, it's a tough pill for them to swallow on the door in, and then you just, how is that a win-win? What would it take for that to be a win-win? So many things would have to fall just right for that to happen. It's a tough needle to thread.
Gordon Wittenmyer here on Sports Talk Chicago. So, Gordon, who do you think the Cubs do target here in free agency?
Whoever's left. They're not going to go out there and set a market for anybody. We've already seen that, right? They did a waiver claim on a guy. Now, because they were so good at being crappy at the end of the season, they climbed the waiver ladder to be closer to the front of the line when a waiver guy came across, and they made a claim and they won it. It was a $10 million flyer on Wade Miley, 1-year deal for $10 million. Good. They have massive needs in that rotation. Now they've got 2 major league starters. I think what you'll find is a heavy look at pitching, but later in the market. And we saw Syndergaard go for a 1-year, $21 million deal. We saw Eduardo Rodriguez go. What did he get? 18? No, he got 15 something a year, 16 something a year on a 5-year deal. And then we saw Barrios get an extension for almost 19 a year. So anyway, when you get to the other side of, we're almost certainly going to have a lockout and a transaction freeze when the CBA expires at the end of December 1st. Whenever we get to the other end of that, I am optimistic that there will be a resolution within a month or two. Some people think it might go into what would be spring training, but either way, I think we'll get a resolution, and we'll get a short free agency period at the end of that. They'll be very active in that, but you'll see guys coming off the board so fast at that point, and you'll see 1- and 2-year deals, I think, max, and just kind of whoever's left. And they'll pick off some established guys that maybe have some risk, but some upside.
How do you gauge the Marcus Stroman rumors to the Cubs?
To the Cubs? I'm not sure what the rumors entail. I'm not sure what. I talked to Marcus Stroman in September about the idea of coming to the Cubs. The Cubs were interested in him as a trade target when he was with the Blue Jays early in his career, and he's open to it. He's more than open to it, but he's also going to play his market out. And if the Cubs want to come to him strong, he's more than willing to sign. I don't think they are, and I don't know what rumors are out there that have any credibility behind them other than just speculation. So when you say, a lot of times when you say rumors, I think, well, somebody's got a source who's saying something. There's a difference between rumors and speculation in my mind.
Let me ask you this, just as a total bigger picture question. When will this team be competitive again?
That's the well, I was going to say $64,000 question. That's the what's the luxury tax level? That's the $210 million question. You know, there's no way to predict. And what's the saddest part of this is, if you're a fan watching this, is that they can't tell you what their plan is for a timeline or what the next core is going to look like. They've got Brennan Davis, who's a really good-looking outfielder who finished the year at AAA. He also doesn't have a lot of minor league time. He had a really great, quick ascent year in 2021 after missing all of 2020. If he continues that, if he picks up where he left off in AAA to start next season, we'll see him in the big leagues, maybe by midseason. Cool. Now, there's also a chance that he struggles a little bit and has to work through some things, which could push him off till maybe September. They definitely want him to get his feet under him in the minors a little more. Beyond that, other than a couple of the pitchers I mentioned, DJ Hertz had terrific year as a pitcher. Again, another guy. He finished at AAA. Finished at AAA, right? Finished at AAA. Yeah, but he jumped, I think, two levels in the organization. He's another guy that you're not going to stick him on the opening day roster. He's going to have to get some more legs under him and see what he's got. Braylon Marquez made a major league debut in one game at the end of 2020 and then did not play at all in 2021. We expect to see him in 2022 at some point out of the bullpen. Everybody else in that system of any potential impact is an A-ball guy, basically. So you're talking years before you can see a homegrown core take shape. And who knows which of those guys fall by the wayside between now and then. There's a lot of distance between A-ball and the big leagues. So you can't identify a core like you even could in 2013. Say 2013, 2014, when the Cubs had, I don't know, 4 guys ranked like 6 guys ranked in the top 100, and 4 of them were like in the top 200 or top 20 on most lists. Brennan Davis is, I think, 18th on one list and maybe 24 on some. He's a top 20-ish prospect, and nobody for miles and miles close to that. So it's really hard to predict now. So then you take it the other way. Well, how can you build something else? Build in a different way. Well, we saw how they planned to do that. They sent all their veterans out, and they got some young guys back. Again, young guys in A-ball and AA, some very, very young. Yu Darvish trade got him. Zach Davies as a fill-in guy for a year, and 4 guys, 3 of which were teenagers, and the other one had just turned 20. So high talent, maybe. High risk, for sure. And so how long is it going to take? What's their will to compete? What's the organizational will to do what it takes to compete? I don't think we've seen a really strong will right now for the foreseeable future. And by that, I mean the next 2 acquisition periods, which is this winter and the trade deadline. I think we're seeing they're going to build a team of short-term guys that, if all goes right, can perform well this year as a team, maybe make the playoffs. The likelihood of that seems pretty slim with where you're starting. And otherwise will be a bunch of short-term guys you can blow up again. You blow up it'll be a roster built to blow up at the deadline if they don't do something special, which is probably the greater likelihood. And so then what happens? Now you got a few more minor leaguers, maybe some guys closer, maybe Brennan Davis. Now you get into next winter, you got a little bit more to predict. but we just don't know. We don't know what that's going to look like. So is it going to be 3 years? They do it real fast. Is it going to be 6 or more? I don't know. Nobody can answer that, including the front office. Like the front office does not have a good answer for a timeline.
And that should be pretty scary.
Or a plan.
That should be pretty scary to Cubs fans who are watching this right now and watching how this team has progressed, especially over the past year or so, that there is really no timeline as to when they're going to be good again.
Exactly. And one of the frustrating things about it, and I think Jed Hoyer's been dealt a tough hand to work with, because Theo got out while the getting was good. Jed takes over when he knows that he's facing the toughest decisions they've had in a decade. And, to his credit, I guess, if you want to look at it that way, he made them. But when he made all those trades in July, his public comments were, "This accelerates our process." So the question became, okay, what's the process? Well, we don't know yet. Well, then how do you know it accelerates? Because we've got more in our system now. Well, that doesn't, you haven't shown me that, but you're facing a rebuild. Well, it's not going to be a rebuild. What do you mean it's not going to be a rebuild? I mean, this was the conversation, and it's not going to be like it was in 2012. But that doesn't mean it's not going to be a rebuild. He says, frankly, I'm not sure what the definition of a rebuild is. The hell you don't know what the definition of a rebuild is. So he talked around it, and then with the chance to follow up a few weeks later, he came back around it again. And, he and I have known each other for a long time. We got in a back and forth that sounded to some people like an argument. We laughed about it afterwards, but he never answered the freaking question. And he doesn't know, because now he says, and he said this in August, we got to see what the CBA looks like. Well, hell, we knew then that the likelihood of them having a new CBA in place by December 1st was slim. And that's December 1st, a month into the free agent period. So you're telling me, by definition of your own words, you don't have a plan. And that should scare the out of Cubs fans who want to see a winner again anytime soon.
Gordon Wittenmyer still here on Sports Talk Chicago. Gordon, a few more questions before we finish out. First off, what's your journey been like in sports media?
Oh man, I was a high school sports editor, and I've been in sports media ever since. I was doing some stringing before I started college and high school sports and stuff. And then, but I always wanted to do baseball. And so I told you, 25 years as a beat writer, did some part-time fill-in stuff before that. But I started in Seattle, a couple of years covering the Mariners. I went to the Angels for a year, spent 7 years in Minnesota covering the Twins, and then came to Chicago. Came into Chicago the first year Lou Piniella did. We both looked at each other at one point, probably a month in, said, "It's a little bit different, isn't it?"
How'd this Cubs beat job come up back in 2008, 2007?
Well, actually, the year before I got this job, the White Sox beat opened up at the Sun-Times, and I knew about it, a friend of a friend of a friend, which is oftentimes how you find out about openings. There's musical chairs in the offseason. At least there used to be when there were actually jobs. But so I reached out to the sports editor at the Sun-Times and went through the interview process. I was told I was one of 2 finalists, and Joe Cowley got the job. He over from the Southtown. And then so I thought, well, that's all there is to that. And then about less than a year later, I get a phone call saying, "Hey, we've got a Cubs opening. Are you interested?" I said, "Absolutely. Let's bring you in for another interview." And so you wind up getting the job.
What's it mean to you to have your name synonymous with Cubs baseball? You've covered them for a long time, obviously, many different eras, Lou Piniella, the World Series, where they are now. What's that mean to you?
Well, a kid growing up in Seattle, I was a huge baseball nut in a town that didn't give a rat's about baseball. I used to think the Kingdom was a paradise and a cathedral until I actually saw places like Wrigley Field. So I always kind of idealized some of the other baseball markets, whether it's New York to some degree, but New York's a city bigger for other things. Definitely Chicago, Boston, Philly's a big sports town, where sports is king. But I always I always kind of thought, what a great place to be if you were covering baseball in a place where fans knew the game, like generationally. They knew their team, they knew their history, they knew the game, and sort of have this relationship with the people you're writing for, that where that they understand it as well as you do. In some cases, probably better, right? And so that's how I always kind of viewed Chicago, as one of those handful of places I would have always loved to cover baseball, and then got a chance to do it. So it is a privilege. I'll tell you this: the first home game in 2007 I covered as a Cubs beat writer. I'd been to Wrigley before as a fan. I'd been to Wrigley before as a visiting writer, but as a Cubs writer, walking out of there, I was the last one out that night, and I just kind of took a moment from the upper concourse to overlook the stadium and kind of just soak it in as, this is a place I want to be, and what a great place to go to work every day.
What's been the best part of covering the Cubs?
I've liked a lot of the people I've covered. Both regimes I've covered, if you count kind of Theo and Jed as the same regime, have done a good job of bringing in people as much as baseball players. I mean, there were a couple of dicks along the way, but almost all of them have been. I flashed on a couple of specifically, but almost all of them have just been great to work with, great to deal with. The people in the organization. Before Theo came in, it was one of the smallest front offices in baseball, which is sort of counterintuitive considering how big of an organization, how big a team they are, big revenue team and all. But they kept things small for a lot of years. But what they did, they also had a lot of long-term employees, a lot of loyal people invested in the organization, wearing a lot of hats. And so there was a different dynamic that, if you got to know somebody in that group, it was somebody who was, you felt that they had deep roots and they were connected. It was kind of cool. It was kind of a cool atmosphere. Dealing with Theo and Jed coming in, a whole new dynamic. It was a great challenge, just kind of like, okay, now they're going to do it a different way. Now everything's going to be up to speed. Everything's going to be modernized. I wonder if I can keep up with it. Let's see. This is going to be a challenge covering. Theo's a master communicator and consequently manipulator. So it's you really got to be on your toes. And I don't mean that in a bad way. He's just that good at that. So, I don't know if there's one thing. I will say this: people a lot of times ask me about covering the championship. I always thought that would be cool. I never thought I would. I mean, I never thought it would actually happen, because it happened when that window presented itself. It happened so fast that I almost didn't see it coming. But people say, well, that had to really, even as a writer who didn't grow up a Cubs fan, you had to really feel something when they won it all. And not really, because I was so in the moment and deadlines and all that, that part of it sunk in later. The one part of that whole run, that October, that sunk in the moment was when they clinched the pennant against Kershaw and the Dodgers at Wrigley Field. And I was down on the field working the field for interviews and stuff. And it was like, they're in the World Series again. Win or lose going forward, that moment was so huge, massively significant for this organization and what this front office was trying to do and what those guys on the field were trying to do, that even if they didn't win it, like, you felt like, okay, they're going to be back here next year. This is the start of, this was big. They're back in the World Series for the first time since color photography, for the first time since integration. I mean, it was monumental. That I felt in the moment.
Gordon, before we finish up today, last question: what's the funniest moment you've been a part of in your career?
I covered when I covered the Mariners. Ken Griffey Jr. Was in his prime on those teams, and that guy was friggin' hilarious. I was just, and there's probably funnier stories, but you made me think of one that I was just sharing with somebody recently. Cubs fans remember Glenn Allen Hill. He was playing for one of those Mariners teams I covered, and not the greatest, most agile left fielder in the world. We were in, I want to say it was Tampa, and he got it. He wore the wrong types of cleats for the turf, and he wound up like backpedaling toward a fly ball. Should have been fairly routine. It was deep, but he didn't have to run far for it. And he went back. He didn't see the wall. His cleats got kind of caught at the same time. Anyway, he just kind of sort of splatted against the wall. The ball just went flying. He wound up on the ground. The next day we go out for batting practice, and there's in athletic tape, somebody had put a chalk outline of a body against the wall. And that was Junior. That was pretty good.
Well, Gordon, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate the time. Best wishes covering what should be an interesting free agency period. And really, hopefully we can catch up again soon. Thank you so much.
Yeah, good word for it. You got it. Thanks for having me on.